Hi, this is Katie with Empowering Astrology, and this is Chiron Healing the Soul. So, thank you all for joining me for yet another webinar. It is an honor and a pleasure to be able to share astrology with you for those who are both beginner astrologers and also those who are continuing to learn. And, Chiron is a topic that's close to my heart, which I'll talk a little bit more in a few moments. It's a newer addition to astrology, so we're still trying to figure it out. And a lot of how I see Chiron has to do with how I'm taught astrology by spirit. And when I say that, I'm a psychic medium, and my astrology teachers aren't always in physical form. So I've gotten a lot of really interesting information that's shaped how I see Chiron and how I use Chiron in my client work. So I'm just sharing my perspective. And of course, Chiron's something that's new. And maybe if you work with astrology yourself, you might have your own perspective. So this is just for me to share and for you to kind of see things from a different perspective and see what resonates for yourself. So this is Chiron Healing the Soul, and today is October 26, 2019. Again, my name is Katie Sweetman. I'm here in Brooklyn, New York. I've been a professional astrologer for about 8 years, and I started Empowering Astrology in 2010 because I wanted to, let's say, express astrology from my own perspective. And at the time, I felt like there wasn't really how do we reframe the chart, and how do we reframe the transits in a way to, let's say, use it in the best possible way. I also am a psychic medium, and that's, I was saying a few moments ago, that what really informs how I see Chiron. So this is just a quick rundown on the agenda. This is more for those who are watching the replay and just kind of want to see how this is unfolding. So let's start things. So I've been always deeply drawn to Chiron, and maybe it's because I'm a Scorpio. Chiron is, it kind of has this juicy archetype metaphor with it. This idea that Chiron represents an area of the chart that is, now depending on who you talk to, wounded, or something that demands our healing. And so for me, it's like, okay, well, what is this? How does that inform my own journey as a person on this planet? How does that help my clients understand themselves better, or help you all understand yourself better? So it's something that I was always reading and searching for more information, but it is a newer addition to astrology. So we don't have the benefit of something that's been around for thousands of years, and we have all this understanding of it. But we will talk about the history in a moment. And the more that I delved into Chiron, the more that I really, the word wounded healer, and if you are new to astrology, if you Google Chiron, they will always say, oh, it's the wounded healer. And I'm like, what's that? Especially when people say, oh, I have my wounded healer in Taurus or Gemini. I was like, what does that mean? That sounds slightly absurd. But there seemed something kind of off about that terminology, especially when people talk about Chiron as the wound that never heals, because that just, I don't know, doesn't seem right. Like I said, just my own personal perspective. How could there be an area of our chart that doesn't want to heal? Now, I do believe that Chiron's a bit of a stubborn area in terms of, let's say, the healing work that we have to do on a soul level, which I will get to in a moment. And as I worked with my clients, I could start to see how Chiron was woven into the background. The work that I do with clients, I'm not your typical astrologer. I'm not like, you sit down with me and I'm like, this is going to happen on this date and this is going to happen on that date. That type of work personally never really connected. I want you to understand, of course, the time in your life, but I also want to get to the underneath, what's fueling this time in your life. And so, Chiron would kind of sneak in, this this kind of underlying pain that hasn't been addressed or healed, or maybe there's a journey that's happened with Chiron that there is some healing work that's been happening over the course of time. Um, so around 2015, I think I was at a point in my life where I was like, I'm gonna do some channeling. And and I think in a way I still do. And I it's funny, when I was preparing for this, I could kind of feel that work coming back in. I wanted to channel the planets. Maybe I wanted to make that a focus of my work at the time. But I did receive a download about Chiron, and every time I go back and read it, it makes like the hairs on the back of my neck kind of tingle. What was said in this channel to me, and it's on my website. If you search on Chiron suffering and knots, is that spirit, or my guides that I work with, they wanted to correct me in the sense that Chiron was not a wound. It was something that was more like a knot in the fabric of our lives that we are working to undo. And when we look at Chiron as a knot instead of a wound, it reframes, or it kind of shifts our consciousness in what we're doing. Now, a knot is something that it can be quite stubborn if you ever tried to undo a knot, but this idea that our healing work is something that it's not this wound that never heals. And how do we undo this knot? Well, we do it with consciousness, we do it with compassion, we do it with love. But when we don't work on our Chiron, it kind of becomes a bit of a stubborn area, and we're going to keep returning to our Chiron over and over again. That's the beauty of astrology, is that everything happens within a circle. It's all about cycles. So as we travel around the zodiac each year with the sun or with the different planets, we keep returning to where our Chiron is, and we keep returning to that story of suffering, inadequacy, loss, separation, that sometimes we cling to a little bit too much, but we are ultimately trying to heal. And I think an important distinction to make about Chiron is, yes, there's the personal element of what we're healing, this idea of self-worth or voice or something else. But ultimately, I think, and this is where my own intuitive work has come in this channel that I received, that it's about connecting our story, our pain, our suffering, to a collective story, something that is part of the human experience, for better or for worse. And when we shift to that level of the collective, it kind of takes us out of the personal side of Chiron. No longer it's like, this is something that happened to me, this is my wound, or this is my pain, this is my suffering. It's like, oh, I'm part of something that's much bigger than myself. And it's when we shift our consciousness that we're able to transcend and to go into our Chiron story and our chart on a, let's say, a much higher perspective. When I'm working with clients, or at least like this is the goal, maybe it's a tall order in one phone call, but spirit will show me like the highest potential of the chart. What is it, when you've managed to kind of clear some space and go within and go deeper into yourself and to unlock things, what is it that, the kind of life or the type of self that you get to express. But you gotta undo those knots. Chiron in astrology, it looks like a key. It looks like the symbol looks like a key. So it's something that we are unlocking over time, hopefully sooner rather than later. So another point that I want to make is, Chiron is a newer edition of astrology. There are other people that are working to understand Chiron. There's certainly astrologers that are really people that created the foundation of our understanding about Chiron. So, I'm building on some of the things that these people have written about or published or, done talks on. And then, I'm bringing hopefully my own perspective, but also the perspective of what Spirit has shared with me. So why Chiron? Why is it something that we should pay attention to? Or, there's so many different things in the chart that demand more attention. Why is Chiron something that should be, of all the different points, something that we should focus on? So, the way that I see things is that we live in a time of profound shift and transformation. I don't have to tell you this, the astrology certainly reveals this, but we just have to look out into the world and see that something is happening on a global and on a human level. And because we are in this time of change and transformation, like we need new language, we need new keys, we need new planets to help us work through this time. And if you know your astrology, up until antiquity, up until 1780, all we knew planetary wise was up until Saturn. Saturn was the last planet that we could see. And so 1780, or it might have been 1781, Uranus is discovered, and it opens up our ability to see beyond this natural barrier. And Chiron is certainly out in this kind of invisible realm. You need a telescope to see it. But this idea that as we open up our consciousness and we're transforming humanity, we need new things to kind of open up these new spaces to deal with what's the demands of this time. So, the world, of course, is quite different than it was 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. So this is why I think that Chiron, it really speaks to a subtlety. It speaks to the work, and it speaks to the healing work that we're doing both personally and collectively. As I mentioned, Uranus, it was discovered in 1780, and that kind of gave us this new revolutionary way of looking at life. We were busting out of the limits and the confines of Saturn. Saturn's boundaries, Saturn's structure. But if you know your history, that part of time was, things were being upended. And then you go into the 1840s, you get to Neptune, the rise of spiritualism, the rise of photography. We're now having another archetype to be able to describe our ability to transcend this physical world. You go to Pluto, 1930, we go deep into the psyche, we go deep into the shadow side of humanity, and certainly the history of that time reflects that archetype. Pluto being the lord of the underworld, something like Eris. Eris was only discovered in 2003. It's a dwarf planet. A lot of people don't really, maybe if you're into astrology, you've heard Eris before, but it's the goddess of discord. And we're certainly living through discordant times. So here's another planet that, maybe the more that we work with it, it's able to help us understand the disorder, the discordance, and the chaos of the time that we live in. So this is about Chiron's discovery. It was discovered in 1977. So, from, let's say, the early 1930s when Pluto was discovered up until about the 70s, you weren't getting any, let's say, new discoveries. But Chiron was almost like on the forefront of this time in astronomy, where we started to discover new planets, new asteroids, new bodies that were further and further out. When Chiron was discovered, they didn't know what to do with it. It didn't act like other planets. It didn't act like an asteroid. It's kind of a comet. It's kind of not a comet. So Chiron, they had to come up with a new class. And this is something called the Centaurs. Chiron being, and we will go into the mythology in a few minutes, but Chiron being the Greek myth, or Greek mythological figure of a centaur, half man, half horse. So there are other bodies that are like Chiron that have been since discovered, and some other astrologers use it. I'm not as familiar with them, so that's why I'm not presenting on it. But just so you know, that's Chiron doesn't act the way other things acted up until that point. It's important just to be aware that Chiron is between the orbit of Saturn and Uranus. So Saturn being, as I was saying, the last thing you were able to see up until the, let's say, the advance of modern astronomy and telescopes, and then your Uranus being the first of the modern planets. So it sort of crosses the divide between the invisible and the visible. Chiron takes 50 years to go around the sun. It has an eccentric orbit, which we'll see in a moment what that kind of sort of looks like. It's important to understand that because of this eccentric orbit, it spends less time in certain signs and more time in other signs. But nevertheless, it takes 50 years to go around the sun. So age 50 is when you will have what's called a Chiron return. This is just something I got. It's like a NASA thing that was on Wikipedia. It just to kind of give you an image, the green outer ring is supposed to be Uranus, the sort of golden ring that's inside of that's supposed to be the orbit of Saturn, and then the purple ring crosses the yellow ring. So this idea that Chiron is not kind of going in a perfect circle around the sun, which is that middle yellow point in the center of this graphic. I tried to find where I read this. It's one of those things that I read a long time ago and it filed away in the back of my brain. So do take this with a grain of salt. But I think I remember reading somewhere that Zane Stein, who's an astrologer, an American astrologer, that when he heard about this new discovery, he contacted the astronomer and was able to get the information that formed what's called the first ephemeris for Chiron. When Chiron was discovered, it was in the sign of Taurus. It was at 3 degrees of Taurus. An ephemeris, if you're new to astrology, it's our ability to be able to know where Chiron's going to be on, let's say today, October 26, 2019, where in the sky is it versus where is it 20 years ago or 20 years from now. But it's Zane Stein, Melanie Reinhardt, Barbara Hancock. Those are the people that will come up a lot if you do some research on Chiron. They were kind of the people that adopted Chiron early and kind of became the bedrock or the foundation of what we understand on an astrological level. And if you're into astrology books, I do recommend Chiron, The Healing Journey by Melanie Reinhardt. It's very kind of philosophical, archetypical, shamanic. It's a good read. It kind of talks about Chiron and this idea of your healing journey. I think she wrote this at the end of the 1980s originally, and then also Barbara Hancock did Chiron, the Rainbow Bridge. The Chiron, the Rainbow Bridge is a little, in my opinion, 1980s new agey, but it might be something that you are drawn to if you are a student of astrology and you're looking to learn more beyond this webinar. It's safe to say that we're still integrating what Chiron means. If you think about it, it's only been 40 years that we've been working with this on an astrological level. And if we could think about things in terms of a collective level, in terms of humanity, it's something that we've only had access to for 40 years as a collective. This idea that there's something within us that represents a collective pain and suffering that is endemic to living in the physical world, but it's something that we are all healing on a soul level. And it's also something that we are, helping the collective heal as well. I'm just going to take a question. Right, so if you are in your Chiron return, we will talk a little bit about what the Chiron means further in this presentation, but it's, it's a time when you really feel this story around pain. I think it's important to understand Chiron in the mythology. And I think we can't get too limited by the astrology or the myth. You do keep in mind that myths are these proto stories that exist like across all cultures. Now, Chiron, we're obviously looking at this from a very Greco-Roman perspective that is a cultural perspective that really informs modern astrology. Certainly, I'm sure this root myth exists in other cultures. So if I'm presenting the mythology, just know it's just a way of accessing an archetype information. In the Greek myth, Chiron was a centaur who was abandoned by his mother, Philyra. And depending on how you read the myth, Philyra was either raped by Kronos, who had taken the form of a horse, or perhaps it was consensual. Nevertheless, when Philyra gave birth to Chiron, she was so disgusted and repulsed that she abandoned Chiron in a cave on Mount Pelion to die. And Apollo, one of the kind of the major gods of Greece, heard the cries of Chiron and adopted Chiron. In the myth, Chiron is taught astronomy, astrology, medicine, healing, prophecy by Apollo. And then in turn, Chiron teaches it to other major Greek characters, Achilles, some other people whose names I'm totally blanking on. But here's a fresco from Herculaneum from the 1st century. If you know your history, Herculaneum was the other town that was destroyed next to Pompeii. And this is a fresco of Chiron teaching Achilles, as in the guy that had the heel that was the only part of his body that was not immortal and gets wounded in a battle. Anyway, I digress. Just another more modern image of Chiron. This one is by John Singer Sargent, who's actually one of my favorite painters. Chiron, and this is where we get the idea of the wounded healer, and the wound that never heals. In the myth, Chiron is immortal, but is wounded by a poison arrow. And despite being this master healer, is not able to heal himself. So he's suffering, and then he pleads to Zeus to make him mortal so that he can die. And I think Zeus took pity on him and then sort of, let's say, raised him up into the heavens to become a constellation. I think it's Centaurus, if I'm remembering that correctly. So I think it's important, and we'll come back to this, that this idea of elevation that happens in the myth, that there's an element of suffering, and that there is a need to, let's say, go to the stars to elevate oneself. And I think that this is reflective in the kind of the collective side of our own healing journey with Chiron, and connecting to the collective experience and being able to, let's say, step outside of ourselves and see beyond how we identify with this story around pain. So Chiron in astrology. So as I was saying a moment ago, the myth is a starting point. I think we need to, let's say, keep a light footing with the myth. I don't think we can be too literal with the myth. And it's Uranus as a planet, for instance, the archetype, how it expresses in astrology doesn't quite, let's say, line up with the myth. It's more like a Prometheus myth. I'm just drawing an example. So this is why I think that we get a little too focused on this idea of the wound that doesn't heal, the wounded healer. And I think we get a little caught in something, and we're not able to kind of see Chiron from a wider lens. But it's certainly, the myth is a starting point. And I think we're drawn to Chiron because there's something there for us. I think that's why there's a curiosity. I think there's probably why there's a curiosity more than some of the other centaurs in astrology, or even some of the minor planets that have been discovered. The myth is charged. This idea of somebody that was born out of really difficult circumstances and was abandoned and was raised by the gods, and gained all this wisdom to be able to teach to other people. There's something there for us to discover. And I mentioned this already, and this actually comes from Melanie Reinhart. She really, and I saw a really great talk with her. Oh God, this thing would have been like 2012. She was in New York doing a talk on Chiron. But she talks about how Chiron crosses the orbit of Saturn and Uranus. So this idea that Chiron is, and she really links it to, like, so let's say the shamanic spiritual side of things, that it can go into a space that's invisible. Anything beyond Saturn is invisible to the naked eye, and bring it into the physical, bring it into the visible. So I think another place where we run into trouble with Chiron is when we try to understand it on an intellectual level. I think we really have to feel Chiron to understand it. And this certainly comes up in my work with clients, how much we don't allow ourselves to feel. We often are up here in our brains. And this is certainly something that astrologers do. We want to intellectualize everything. We want to, Chiron gets discovered and we're like, okay, what does this mean? And we go to the ephemeris and we're looking at transits and we're looking at charts. And I think that's only part of the picture. I think we kind of lose the point of Chiron. And if you have worked with Chiron in astrology, I mean, certainly, this is from my own perspective, it's a really subtle influence. Chiron, it shows us a place where we're suffering. It shows us where there's a story around pain. Maybe a place where we feel wounded, or abandoned or separated. And this is kind of lending itself to the myth. And this again, this kind of like a personal pet peeve when I hear people just say, "Oh, what's Chiron? It's the wounded healer." And I think that when we're learning astrology, we sometimes repeat things that we've learned, but we don't understand what it means. And I think sometimes when we say things like it's the wounded healer or the wound that doesn't heal, it gives people the wrong idea. Because certainly if I told people that they have a wound in their chart that will never heal, they're not going to be probably very happy. So I've just noticed that Chiron works on a very subtle level. If you have what's called a Chiron transit, it's probably not showing up in your physical life, with some exceptions, which I will talk about later. I think Chiron, and for us to really connect with our Chiron, in addition to feeling it, we have to be able to almost zoom out on our life, zoom out on our chart, zoom out on ourselves, and almost like see ourselves from an outsider perspective. Sometimes I'll say with a client, okay, well, if you were watching a play, if you're in the audience and watching somebody that looks just like you, who is you, what do you see? How would you describe the situation that you're healing or seeing? And I think that Chiron in many ways is a linchpin for the chart. When we start to work on that Chiron, work on that knot, we see how much it's pulling at different things, pulling at our nodes, pulling at our Saturn, pulling at some of the other outer planet configurations in our chart. So I feel, and I think this is what Spirit's kind of implored on me, is that it's a knot that has to be undone. And I think another way in which we can zoom out and see the energy of Chiron on a much bigger level, at least within ourselves, is to see Chiron as a knot in the fabric of our life, or a rip or a tear in the tapestry of our life, and we're like, oh, that's something that I have to repair. That's something that I need to fix, how something is created or woven, because otherwise it's like a snag or a tear that you keep running up against. So I think in this, in the myth of Chiron, it does talk about, initially it talks about separation and abandonment. And the way that I see the world, the way that I see astrology, at least the lens in which I see astrology, is how do we return to unity? So whether we're working with our Chiron or our Pluto or our Saturn or our Neptune, these are points in the chart that are giving us a story, showing us a path where we have to work on something to return to unity. And when we are in separation, we're not in unity. There's something that needs to be reconciled. So when that knot is undone, there's more flow. When that tear in the fabric of our lives is repaired, there's more connection, there's more unity. So we'll come back to this point, Chiron as this idea of a personal pain that's reflective in a collective pain. I think an example that I can give is, one of the ways, I remember when Chiron went into Aries, this would have been, I believe it's April of 2018. And on the day that Chiron went into Aries, I was about to get on the subway in Manhattan, and there was a man, like a soldier who had his legs, amputated, who was getting on the train also in a wheelchair. And I remember this idea of like, sometimes the wound is physical, but this idea that I think we really feel Chiron when we see somebody that's overcome a limitation and then we are inspired by it. So you see it with the people who are doing like gold medals in the Paralympics, or you see people who have overcome a great suffering, whether it's an abuse or trauma, and then they go and they help others heal. I think that's where we come into this idea of Chiron as the wounded healer, but in a way that feels a lot more empowering because the person has transcended the story. I think that's when we start to unlock the higher potential of the chart. But if somebody that has, let's say, experienced an abuse and pain, they've depersonalized that pain, they've connected to what it is on a collective level, they want to help people who suffer similarly. That's the level of the collective. And if there's always going to be darkness in this world, and I'm saying this as a Scorpio, and so there's always going to be like a story of pain and suffering around certain things, abandonment, loss, rejection by the mother. But if that's a collective knot and a collective suffering in the fabric of humanity, everybody is doing their part to heal that knot, or on the flip side, add to it. So I'm proposing is that when we start to work with our Chiron, we do with this consciousness, we do with this awareness that we are not adding to the knot. We are transcending, we are working on the knot for the good of humanity, for the collective. So yes, we, in order to rise above, in order to go into the heavens like Chiron did, what Zeus did for Chiron, we have to depersonalize our Chiron. It's no longer something that happened to me. It's an experience that connects me to humanity. It connects me to the collective. And I think that when we transcend the kind of the lower energy in the chart, when I say lower is not bad. Lower is just limited. It's contracted. You're working in a smaller space. When you transcend this kind of lower energy, you have more space to work with. And I think that this is always something that I'm trying to do in my work and my writing, at least this the idea, or working with clients, where how do I help lead you to a new space so that you feel like you have more room. And that's what the light of consciousness, that's what awareness, that's what breakthrough does. It takes that contraction, it takes that smaller us and it gives us more space. So Chiron is just another tool in our toolbox. I just feel that it's a very small yet powerful tool in our toolbox. And when we start to do this work, we're really healing on a soul level. And I'll use this moment to really explain, what is soul healing? And I think, we use this word, at least in English, this idea of the soul is something that is bigger than us, is bigger than Katie, it's bigger than you, it's like the higher self. Does the soul need to be healed? Well, here's where I think we're kind of getting into some semantics. Now, I do call this soul healing because I think it's a word that collectively we agree, at least in English, means something. But I think to make a distinction is that there's the soul. Now, the soul is an energy that doesn't need healing, it's immutable, but there's the soul, there's like a filter through our many lives, through our experiences, where there's some imprints. That's where you get your knots. That's where there's a trauma, and it kind of registers at a level energetically, emotionally, and spiritually that's bigger than the self. So when I say soul healing, like what we're doing is we're really, to use that metaphor of the tapestry again, or fabric, or whatever, energetic fabric, we're doing the work to repair it. That's healing, just so that the energy of the self, the energy of the soul is not, kind of passing, interfacing with this energy that can be very dense. It can feel like knots. It can feel like a contraction. So, I feel like Chiron helps us to connect with the space that is kind of outside of this physical world. If we were make a proposal that Chiron kind of connects us to the astral realm, the realm of emotions, the psychic realms. It kind of helps us connect to maybe even the causal realm, which is where the Akashic records are, where the information of the soul and the soul's experiences in other lifetimes reside. But this Chiron, we're not dealing with it on a personal, like day-to-day mundane level. It's really helping us to open up into something that transcends the self. And to go back to that earlier point that I made about, we're in really interesting times. We're in a time of great transformation, both on a collective, on a human, on a personal level. And we need new tools to upgrade, new tools to transform. And so Chiron gives us this key that we weren't ready for it before. If I could make that argument, that's only in the last 40 years that humanity has been able to start to integrate what this tool means. So when we have, and the work that I do, I'm coming from the perspective that we've had many different lifetimes. I don't think you have to believe in that in order to kind of connect with this webinar, of course, but even if you look at it from this life, we have these experiences and they leave a mark, they leave a residue. This idea that everything is kind of going into this tapestry that's called our life. And so we're able to work on that tapestry. We're able to work on that energy, that imprint, so that we can start to free up space. We can start to move beyond these limitations. So, sometimes, and what I get intuitively, at least from spirit, is that Chiron represents a point in the chart where maybe we've repeatedly experience suffering in that part of that that theme, that part of our life, that kind of that archetypical theme repeatedly. So there's a lot of material for us to work on through that point, that does connect us to other lifetimes. So, how do we heal? I kind of said this already, but healing happens through consciousness, through awareness. When we, consciousness, it's like those aha moments. Like, I live for those aha moments. We all have had them. And that's what I want to bring to my work. I want somebody to be like, oh my, they see, something completely differently. And we have that like aha moment. And, and art and how we talk about these moments, it feels like a thunderbolt. It feels like a lightning strike. In astrology, I believe the planet of consciousness and the opening of consciousness is Uranus, which is like very electric planet. I digress, but we need that awareness. And then, when we go in a few moments about what Chiron means in your chart by sign and by house, you can start to hopefully see that there's a story. Maybe that story is visible to you, maybe it's invisible. That especially if it's invisible, there's an aha moment. You start to see that there are these threads that have been there over and over again that keep weaving and going through different points of your life. And when we have those aha moments, when we see something for what it is, we have this kind of phrase in English. It's like something, once we see it, we can't unsee it. So once you have that aha moment around your Chiron, hopefully you'll now interface with that energy in a very different way, in a much more intentional and conscious way. So, again, we need to be able to go to this level where we are kind of transcending the self, transcending our ego, the Katie level, for instance, for me, and going to something bigger and to this like much more elevated, seeing kind of like the big picture, the tapestry, to be able to kind of connect to the soul's experiences in many lives, and even the soul's experience in this life, to be able to start to do this level of healing. So I think a question that we all need to ask ourselves going forward is like, what are we weaving? This idea that how are we adding, how are we subtracting, how are we augmenting this tapestry that is our life? And we can be in unconsciousness, which means that we are just kind of adding to something, almost like throwing things into another room or a drawer and just closing it and not dealing with it. Like that's, unconsciousness. But we're in this journey to come back to unity, which means we need to look at all the things that we haven't been looking at, Chiron giving this tool to do so. So, what are we weaving? I think that's something that we need to go forward and ask ourselves kind of over again. Are we adding to the knot? Are we loosening the knot? Because this is a knot that will, and I say this because, this is kind of how spirit has presented to me. It's like a knot that will wrap itself around different parts of our life, and it restricts and maybe even chokes an experience. So we want to certainly loose it. I'm just looking at the comments. Yes, Lisa, this idea that, when we have those aha moments, that we're kind of connecting to the archetype of the phoenix, we're able to kind of rise out of something, which the phoenix is one of Scorpio's 3 archetypes. There's like this kind of triad in the archetype of Scorpio. But yeah, that's a good point, Lisa. So I kind of alluded to this already, when the healing is physical, we talked a lot about emotional healing and psychic healing and healing the soul, but sometimes Chiron shows up on a very physical level. Not always. I've noticed that Chiron mostly operates as something that's running. It's like a program that's running around in the background. But sometimes it becomes something very physical that we have to heal. It can show up, and I've seen this in client charts. I've seen this in the charts of people that I've known. as something's congenital, meaning it's something that you're born with, or even a disability. I had a client who had cerebral palsy, and I just remember Chiron being opposite. It was either Mercury or Mars, but this ability to be able to have full control over your motor functions. Um, Chiron can also be a physical manifestation of an emotional wound. I have an example from my own life, and this is a very personal share. This would have been 6 years ago. I was in St. Lucia, which is an island in the Caribbean. I was there by myself. I was celebrating let's say, like a major personal milestone at that time, but I was there by myself. And I remember like I had like paid off all my debts. I was in a good place financially. And I was like, why don't I just treat myself to something? But I was there by myself, and it really weighed me down that I was not able to share that experience with another person. And I remember at the time, I'd gone through a major life at the end of a relationship, didn't have any friends after this relationship ended. Was in a very negative relationship. And I just remember thinking, like, I didn't have anybody. And so the day of my last day there, I remember, just being really sad. And I remember thinking, I want to know that if something happens to me, that somebody will be there for me. And it was just this very spontaneous, but very emotionally charged demand. And a voice said to me, be careful what you wish for. And later that day, I was in the ocean, and I just want to preface this by saying I grew up near the ocean. I'm a swimmer. What happened was just a total freak accident. I got thrown down by a wave, and I landed on my left shoulder, dislocated it and shattered it in 3 places. Mind you, I'm by myself. I am in a foreign country. I am supposed to fly back to New York the next day, but I've got to deal with the fact that I'm in a lot of pain, shock, and I've just asked for this. And when I pulled myself out of the ocean, I was like, wow, I'm about to find out who's going to be there for me. It was my parents. And I'll kind of circle back to that point when I talk about Chiron and the sign and houses. And you might see how that Chiron moment manifested for me. I mentioned this story because it was either that day or like a couple days before or after Chiron stationed in the sky. If you know your astrology, I know maybe some of you are beginners, maybe some of you actually work with astrology on a student level or on a professional level. But when a planet stations, we know this was like Mercury retrograde, when the planet stops in the sky and it turns forward or backwards, it saturates the collective with its energy. So this accident happened on a Chiron station, and it was a physical manifestation of this deep emotional wound that I had around connection and feeling like somebody was going to be there for me. I don't know if I had to happen that way, like if that was just my karma. I certainly asked for it, and I'm at peace at this point with having asked for it. But I wanted to kind of share that sometimes, if you go back and you look at the energy of what was going on, let's say during an accident or other major moments of your life, and you see Chiron playing a role, the kind of the thought process for you now is, how is that reflective? How is that accident or whatever reflective of a deeper story that's been showing up in different ways? So yes, sometimes Chiron is a physical, it happens on a physical level. And like I said, I don't think this happens very often, but it taught me a really powerful lesson around Chiron and being careful about what I wish for. So your Chiron, what does it mean for you? If you're new to astrology, if you're new to Chiron, this is what the glyph of Chiron looks like. If you have seen your chart, or if you have your chart handy, this is the symbol that you are looking for. So wherever Chiron is in your chart, ideally you know your exact birth time because that gives you that very personalized look at the heavens that becomes a map for you. Um, that part of your chart feels tender. It almost feels like scar tissue. It's something that when it gets activated at different points throughout the year, whether it's a full moon or whether Mars is there or whether another planet is there, something's getting pressed on. So I know personally all about scar tissue because I have a lot of scar tissue in my shoulder. I also have a plate and 9 screws. So anyway, so this idea of Chiron being a knot in the fabric of your life. So I don't want you to look at your chart and think, oh, I've got the wounded healer in my 5th house. I will come personally and be like, don't do that. It's an area that you need to work on this knot to, it might feel like a wound. I think sometimes that's the best word that we can come up with in English. But it is an area that you can undo, you can loosen it, and you can loosen it with your consciousness and your awareness. Um, when that Chiron gets activated, it speaks to these themes that over and over again show what makes us suffer. And we'll get to in a few moments the different ways in which that can happen. So this is a lot of information on one slide. If you're watching the video replay, this is your moment to maybe pause and read and integrate and then come back to the audio. If you're listening to this on just the audio, you might want to look at the slides. So this is, what is the knot around in your chart? So Chiron and Aries, the knot, and by the way, Chiron is in Aries right now. So Chiron has now come back to Aries after 50 years, by the way. So Chiron and Aries, the knot is around courage, action, individuality, and anger. I, when Chiron was in Aries, it was the late 60s into the first, let's say, 7 years of the 1970s. I think it was 1968 to 1977. And this is obviously not always, but I, sometimes have clients who are the children of Vietnam vets, and they grew up in a very violent household where the war kind of came home to them. And sometimes that Chiron and Aries talks about feeling like you're intimidated, or you don't have the courage, or you're kind of not safe. So there's this idea that in this life you're really needing to find your power and find your courage and being able to step out and move forward. Chiron and Taurus. So Chiron actually was in Taurus when it was discovered in 1977. The knot is around value. It's around self-worth. It's around the body. So I have Chiron and Taurus. So for me, it's very, very physical, the body. So it's an area where you're really having to find your self-worth. You're really having to find value in your life, and maybe even valuing the body. So Chiron in Gemini, the knot is around your voice. It's around communication. It's around learning. There should be a comma after learning in the slide. So, I've just noticed that with people with Chiron and Gemini, this idea of being able to use their voice or being heard is a kind of a button that gets pressed in their life. And so you have Chiron and Gemini, if you were born approximately in the 80s, from like 83 to the end of the 80s. Chiron and Cancer, the knot is around emotional connection, family. And I put the mother, in air quotes, because this idea that Cancer does represent the archetype of the mother, the archetype of nurturing and care and feeling safe and being held. And maybe Chiron and Cancer, that's not something that you've been able to actively have in your life. Chiron and Leo, the knot is around identity, self-expression. Chiron and Leo is kind of in the 90s, sometime in the early 90s. Sorry, I don't know the exact dates. They're in that link I sent to everybody. It's Chiron sign tables. Anyway, so with Chiron and Leo, it's, there might have a hard time expressing your true self. Maybe there's this idea of identity and not being able to express your identity. I should also add that Leo is talents. So this idea that you need to really undo this knot about opening up what makes you you, your talents. Talents, of course, come in very different ways. Chiron in Virgo, the knot is around perfection, health, duty, and service. Maybe there's this like not being able to fully make something perfect with Chiron and Virgo. Um, I'm curious if anybody who is listening has Chiron and Virgo. You might be a little on the young side, because this would have been in the 90s. Chiron spends the least amount of time in Scorpio, and I believe it's Libra. Somebody came up, I was at a party and I was talking at Chiron, and she was older. She had Chiron and Scorpio. She was born in the late 40s. And she said, like, why does Chiron spend so little time in Scorpio? And I was like, thank God. It's funny, Chiron spends the least amount of time in Scorpio, and I think Pluto spends the least amount of time in Scorpio. And I was like, I think, the heavens are actually kind of looking out for us, because imagine spending 30 years, like I know Pluto spends 30 years in Taurus, the opposite sign of Scorpio. Imagine Chiron spending like 10 years in Scorpio. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go to Libra. So Chiron in Libra, the knot is around relationship, connection, how you socialize. Libra does talk about social convention, kind of the social contract. So maybe there's this like needing to go by the rules, but what happens when you break those rules? Libra is also equity. So that might also kind of weave itself into your experiences. If you were born in the 40s, I think you would have to have been born in the mid 90s for Chiron to be in Libra. Chiron and Scorpio, as I was saying, like Scorpio is an intense archetype. And if Chiron talks around this story of suffering and pain that we're trying to transcend, as you can imagine, in Scorpio, it deals with pretty heavy material. When I see Chiron and Scorpio, when I see Chiron, especially in the 8th house, which we'll go to in a moment, there's a very intense story around pain and suffering. Sometimes there's been a traumatic event. Sometimes it's just something as simply as learning to be more vulnerable. Sometimes there's a kind of a pain and suffering around secrecy, not being able to be true, like reveal something, and also sexuality. Chiron in Sagittarius, the knot is around faith, belief. Maybe there's a crisis of faith if you have Chiron in Sagittarius. You would have to have been born, I think, in the late 90s or maybe early 2000s or even the early 50s for Chiron to be in Sagittarius. I think you're going to be tested on what you believe in. And even, so you can kind of open up that knot if you have Chiron in Sagittarius. Chiron in Capricorn, the knot is around responsibility, maturity, power structure, the father, Capricorn being this sign that's like archetypically connected to this father energy. So you're learning to, maybe open up to finding your own power, finding your own place in the world, and maybe that's been a little difficult. Chiron, and you would have been, I think, approximately born in the 1950s if you have Chiron and Capricorn. Chiron in Aquarius, there's this knot around belonging on a bigger level, community, friendships. So that's something that you're really trying to open up and not feel so disconnected from humanity. Chiron and Pisces. You know, if you're in your early 50s, you would have had your Chiron return in Pisces. And I remember seeing this show up again and again with clients who were going through their Chiron return in Pisces. There was this deep existential, dare I say, wound. I think that there was this energy or this unresolved energy around your connection to spirituality, to God, to source, universe, whatever you want to call it. And sometimes when that knot is existential, it feels so vast because it's hard to really get a handle on something like that. And so this idea that there's a knot around spirituality and existence. So if Chiron in the sign talks about a type of energy, then the house is like where it's happening. That's like the semantics, the grammar, I forget what the word is, of how we kind of construct our sentences in astrology. The houses talk about where things are happening. The sign talks about the energy. And so the sign expresses itself through the house. So you might have Chiron in Gemini, but you have to see what house that Chiron's in and to see where that Chiron and Gemini energy, where that knot around communication, ideas, information, movement is expressing. So that house might be an area that kind of consistently feels like it's a sore spot, like there's some scar tissue that's there. So the knot is expressing itself through, if you have Chiron in the first house, who you are. You know, the first house in astrology, it's you know, and this is also with the rising sign too. That area is almost like a second sun. It's like the other part of the identity in addition to the sun being the ego, the first house being kind of how you readily express that self. So Chiron the first, you feel that maybe you can't be who you are, or like being able to move forward in life because there is that kind of root energy of Aries in the first house. Sometimes, not always, you know, maybe there is something physical because the first house can be a very like physical place about your Chiron. If you have Chiron in the second house, that knot is expressing itself through how you earn a living, what you own and what you need. You know, this idea of the second house is an area that talks about our material life and our material needs. It's also a place where self-worth and value also comes in. Chiron in the third house, so it's how you know, the knot is expressing how you communicate. It could be education, schooling, you know, how you think, how you process information, how you are heard, so your voice. Chiron in the fourth house, the knot is expressing itself through family or ancestry, your home, and also your emotional needs, because the fourth house, even though it is the house of home and family, it's the part of the chart that forms the foundation of the chart. It's the root. It's the, you know, it's what supports the whole chart. And you know, it's an area where you need to feel supported. You need to feel like you've got your inner circle, you've got your family. And when you don't feel supported, that's going to affect all the chart because it's such a important part of the chart. But there might be some issues with family, with Chiron in the fourth. Chiron in the fifth house, you know, Chiron is expressing itself through this idea of persona and identity. The fifth house is where we get to express who we are. You know, the first house is like a very instinctual and rudimentary part of the self. The fifth house is talents, our abilities. It's where we kind of show off and we have fun. It's also children. It's where we kind of have this very physical expression of who we are. Chiron in the sixth house, the knot is expressing it itself on how you take care of yourself, how you, let's say, take care of your daily life, showing up, being on time, taking care of things, but also how you take care of your body. So health, it might, excuse me, be an area that's very much about the real world, including your own physical body. Chiron in the seventh house. So the knot is expressing itself on how you connect. The seventh house being this point of socialization in the chart. It is relationships. It is serious committed relationships as well, but it's where we're learning face to face to connect with people. So you're really opening up that knot in an area that's very intrinsic to human life. I mean, you could say that all the parts of the chart are intrinsic to human life, but the seventh is very, face to face, tete a tete, like you see it. So, when you have Chiron in the seventh house, you're really working on this knot around relationship and connection and partnership. So Chiron in the eighth house. So you're learning to open up this knot that may be a very private knot. When I see Chiron in the eighth house for the charts of my clients, I know to tread a little lightly. There's probably a deep story around Chiron in the eighth. It could be a story around something that's happened traumatically, could be something around sexuality, but it's an area where you're really going into the deepest parts of yourself to be able to transform them, to be able to open up this knot. And it does mean, in a way, kind of facing some of your fears. Chiron in the ninth, the knot is expressing itself through how you see the world. The ninth house, yes, it is the house of higher education and religion and philosophy and foreign travel, but it's a place that really shapes how we see the world and how we see ourselves in the world. And it's a place where we can get very limited in how we see ourselves and how we see the world. So if you have Chiron there, you have to make sure that that knot, that contraction is not keeping you from seeing a wider truth or even more possibilities as opposed to the truth that you think is the truth. Chiron in the 10th house, the knot is expressing itself through your career, or even something that's the 10th house being the highest point in the chart. So it's where you are able to step into a role in the world. It's your ambitions, it's your responsibilities. And maybe if Chiron is there, you're really undoing this knot of being able to kind of step into your own power, step into a professional place in the world. I will also say, and I kind of make this point in a further slide, that when Chiron's in the 10th, Chiron is very much tied to your career. So I'll get to that in a few moments. Chiron in the 11th house. So the 11th house being this place where we talk about, or we experience friendship and community and social connection. So that's when the knot is expressing itself. And I've just noticed when there is a story around the 11th house, whether Chiron is there or Saturn or even the nodes, particularly the South Node, there is a story around feeling like an outsider. So the knot is expressing itself in a place where you have to learn to be connected to humanity, to not feel like an outsider, to find your people. Chiron in the 11th house. So you might have stories that, let's say, show up through your experience, through your social experiences, and even your friendships and your experiences with community. Chiron in the 12th. So the knot is existential. Sometimes when things are in the 12th house, it depends on the person, it's unconscious. It's an area of the chart that can feel a little separate and tucked away. So, there is a sense that you need to go very deep within if you have Chiron in the 12th to really open up this knot around your connection to source, the other side, God, whatever you want to call it. Of course, there's this kind of resonance with the energy of Pisces, but there is a need to kind of let go of something, and maybe whatever that is very deeply buried or repressed or hidden. Chiron in the 12th. This is, depending on where Chiron is in your chart, some of these things might be like, oh yeah, that, and maybe not that. And so this is just to kind of give you a starting point to kind of talk about, let's say, a range of experience of Chiron in a sign, and how, that could potentially express itself with Chiron in a house. So this is your healing work. Your whatever that story is that's reflected by the sign that Chiron is in and the house that Chiron's in, is an area that you're trying to depersonalize. The more that you depersonalize, and depersonalization does not mean to detach. It just means it doesn't make up a part of your identity. Something that Chiron, something that Spirit said in that channel that I got is that don't let suffering add letters to your name. So, this idea that when we connect to our Chiron, it can't be something, that has added something to our name, added something to our identity. And so it's in that we're able to unlock the higher potential of the chart. And, as a point of, maybe for beginners, this might be an intermediate point, but look at the solar chart too. So if you are a Capricorn, for instance, what solar house is your Chiron in? I'm a Scorpio. I have Chiron in Taurus. The Taurus is Scorpio's solar seventh because it's the seventh sign from your sun. That's going to give you another layer of information, but I would definitely start with the information of the exact chart. But I also say this for those who don't have their birth time. So look at the solar chart. I think the example that I wanted to give, and I think this goes back to the story that I shared, why was it that it was, so important that my parents, they would have hopped on the next flight to St. Lucia, but from where they lived in the Baltimore area, they would not have been able to get there by the time, I was going to fly back to New York, because I have Chiron in the 4th. I have Chiron in the 4th in Taurus. So my story that kind of keeps that button that keeps getting pressed, that knot that I'm undoing, it shows up in family. It shows up in emotional connection. So that was, in that moment when Chiron turned station, and, when a station happens in astrology, it saturates the collective with the archetype of that planet. Of course, everybody experienced that day differently. It just happened to me, for me, I actually had a physical wound, but it opened up this deeper healing around emotional connection and family. So that's a very personal example. And you might, as you're watching this, as you're thinking about how Chiron shows up in your own chart, and I don't know, maybe you want to share in the comments, that is your own example. So if you want to get a richer portrait of your Chiron, I would look to the ruler. So in the example that I gave you from myself, I have Chiron and Taurus. So that's what's called a Venus ruled sign. And then you find where Venus is in your chart. What is it doing? This gives you another layer of information. Like I have Venus in Scorpio. So that kind of gives me some more information about the type of knot that I'm undoing on a personal level and on a collective level. And then further, then you want to put in the aspects. Now, I'm not going through the aspects because this would become a 7-hour webinar and we all have a lot of things to get done in our lives. So I will point out one aspect that really, when it shows up in a client read, that I really pay attention to is the yod. This is for my intermediate students or my advanced students or even professionals that are watching this. I will sometimes see Chiron at the apex of a yod. So a yod is two planets forming a sextile with the inconjunct, the quincunx, and Chiron being at the apex of that yod. And that is a demand, an imperative, a soul level imperative for you to heal that Chiron. It's like some 1982 births, it will show up. I think like in October, there was like a yod, because I have a couple of clients with October 1982 birthdays. And Chiron at that apex of the yod, it's like, you've got to heal this. So if you have that, or, I'm just kind of tossing it out there, how an aspect would show up. I mean, Chiron, when it's part of a bigger aspect structure, a stellium, it's an aspect to the sun or the moon. It's a Chiron that you've got to really learn to work with. Somebody asked me this question when I was talking about this webinar on Facebook, and it's a good question. What if you were born with Chiron retrograde? I was born with Chiron retrograde. The way that I see retrograde planets in the chart is that it's a planet that we have to do some extra work on. We have to, there's something there for us to heal. We have to go a little bit deeper, for instance. So, for me, I guess I got to do some more Chiron work in my chart. It's, it kind of requires more attention, especially since my Venus is in retrograde. So, it's part of this opposition in my chart. And what if Chiron is prominent? So what would a prominent Chiron look like in your chart? In astrology speak, this would be a angular Chiron. So Chiron in the 1st, the 4th, the 7th, or the 10th. A Chiron that's on the angle. The ascendant, descendant, MC, IC. If you are a beginner student, if your Chiron is in the same sign as your sun or your moon, it's potentially a prominent Chiron. It means that how you express your emotions, the moon, or how you express who you are, there's a knot. So I've seen this with people with Chiron sun, who there's a story where they're really learning to be themselves. They're really learning to be the sun, to be, to shine that light with the moon. And I especially noticed this with people who had Chiron in Aries with the moon. And that's where sometimes the home environment growing up was maybe chaotic, violent, or there was something that really made you feel unsafe. So that kind of created that layer of emotional material that needs to be healed. So, when Chiron is on the ascendant, for example, you are Chiron. I know that was a question that I got before this webinar. Yes, if you have Chiron on the ascendant, it's very important. You're learning to be Chiron. Maybe you feel called to be of service. And I will add that those who have a prominent Chiron, helping others and having a compassion to help others based on your own experiences really much drives your life. And if you've Chiron, I think it's in your career house or your career sign, it means that you're learning to kind of be Chiron on a professional level. But sometimes there's sometimes wherever Chiron is, there's a shyness is not quite the right word I'm looking for. There's a hesitation and there's a reservation. It's not something that maybe necessarily comes easy for us because it's it feels a little unsafe. It might, there's that knot that's there. But I think that when you really transcend your Chiron story, you're able to, let's say, be Chiron on a professional level. It's very public, the 10th house. Like, you inspire people to transcend their limitations, to transcend their wounds or the things that make them suffer. So there's usually, when I see Chiron wrapped up in the natal story, there's some personal story around suffering that you're healing, but in order to do so, you're kind of helping others. You're connecting to, um, you're taking your personal story and you're really using it to help empower people. That's how somebody transcends their Chiron. Interestingly enough, now that I think about it, Venus being my career planet, being opposite Chiron, I want people to transcend their own limitations and suffering. I want to empower people to be their best self, to be their highest self. I'm just gonna check the comments. Chiron transiting the natal south node. Natal Chiron Aquarius in the third. Sorry, I'm trying to process all this information. If I'm saying your name right, Kalkea. When Chiron is in transit, it's not, we don't always see it so obviously. It's like when we zoom out, we see a reoccurring story. If Chiron is going over the south node, it might be a very old story, a story that connects us to other lifetimes. It's something that we really need to go back to, something that's old, in order to heal. Chiron in Aries on the south node. So when people have south node in Aries, there is a deep material, deep soul experience around, I'm sorry, how to put this in English. I see people that have really occupied these archetypical stories around being the warrior, being somebody who is on their own, being singular, having to fight for themselves. North Node in Libra, you're learning to find peace. You're learning to find cooperation. You're learning to find connection and partnership. So there might be something, if Chiron's on the South Node in Aries, that's really maybe sometimes even pulling you away from that North Node. I will say sometimes when I see Chiron square the nodes, you have to really work on that Chiron in order to integrate both the nodes. It's like there's something that you kind of keep running up against with that square that's really forcing you to get into that nodal story. Chiron in the midheaven, Amanda, as I was saying, that's, Chiron in the 10th house, Chiron in the midheaven, your experiences in life, your very personal experiences are informing your professional life. And you might want to be somebody that helps people, helps empower people, helps people heal based on your own stories. But with Chiron in the midheaven, it may have not come to you so easy, because you might feel this like knot around being able to fully step into your professional potential. Chiron trine Venus. Here's the thing about trines. Trines are something that we're able to easily connect to. So if Chiron and Venus are trying, maybe there's just a natural sympathy. Venus, is something that there's a lot of sympathy with Venus. It kind of is always thinking about the other person. Chiron square the nose, as I was saying, it's, you've got to really, it's like important for your soul's evolution in this lifetime to really work on that Chiron. So the Chiron return. So I know some of you who are on this call, you've indicated that you're going through the Chiron return. So this is for my people that are in your late 40s or in your early 50s. Chiron returns to the degree that it was at about age 50. So Chiron, as I've said previously, it has an irregular orbit. depending on where Chiron was when you were born, you'll have what are called the quarters. So Chiron makes what's called the opening 90-degree square, and then it goes to the opposition, you get the closing square, and then you get the return. Depending on where Chiron was when you were born, the time between those 4 points might be very long or very short. So it's we can't really focus on these quarters as these passages like we do, let's say, Saturn or Uranus, because it's irregular. But Chiron does move back to it where it was when we were born at around age 50. When Chiron returns to where it is, there can be like a spiritual and existential crisis. I think that the Chiron return should be seen in context with other uh, life passages. You have what's called the Uranus opposition around age 42, where you have the classic midlife crisis, like, oh my God, what am I doing with my life? Is this really what I want to do? You get what's called the Saturn opposition around that time as well. There's a need to readjust or to restructure or to kind of solidify. And then you get into the late 40s and into the early 50s, and then it's like you feel that on a soul level, am I doing what I need to be doing? Am I healing what I need to be healing? So, when we have the Chiron return, now I'm not speaking from personal experiences. I'll be 41 next month, so I've still got a little bit to go. But there's a story that demands our attention during the Chiron return. So this is what I've seen with my clients. There is let's say if you have Chiron in Aries, you now have to face where you haven't stepped up or taken action. Aries being ruled by Mars, you demands courage now. It demands forward movement. And if you have felt like you haven't been able to take control or take command, Mars, Aries, then that's a story that might be coming up around now. It might even be some really old stuff around not feeling safe or having to kind of constantly fight for yourself. I'm just kind of tossing that, maybe that's where that's coming in. When my clients were going through their Chiron return in Pisces, a lot of really deep existential emotions were coming up. What is this all about? Why, I'm a good person. I keep doing good things, but it never works out. There's almost a hopelessness sometimes with that Chiron and Pisces. And you might have stories where things have really tested your faith. And so that might have really come up for you to have a new consciousness around during the Chiron return. This idea that we work on our Chiron, we have to be able to see it as part of a bigger picture, as part of a bigger tapestry, in order to have a shift in consciousness and how we work on it and how we heal it. So I think that when we have the Chiron return, there's the question of, have we done our healing? So if, I'm just using this as an example, I'm sure this is not the case with anybody on this webinar. Like if you've just lived a very unconscious life, you're just kind of going on reaction and doing what you think you're supposed to be doing because that's what your friends do or that's what your family told you to do. And then there's things that you just haven't worked on. And like, look, guys, there's a lot of walking wounded people out there. You might get to the Chiron return and it might really demand your attention. And if there's an illness or something comes up during the Chiron returns, like, how is that a physical manifestation on something emotional that hasn't been dealt with? So for those of you who are listening who are in your Chiron return, do share your experiences. This is of course just based on what I've seen in other clients, but it tends to be this time where everything feels a little bit more tender. And the Chiron return is about a year. That's this kind of passage of time that you're going through when Chiron returns to the degree that it's at. So this is a good moment to check in, see if there's questions. I know some of you guys have asked questions already. That's what I'm here for. What about Sun square Chiron? But the Sun is in the South Node. If the Sun is on the South Node, it means you were born near an eclipse. So the Sun, sorry if you can hear the banging. It seems like my neighbors have decided to do this time to do some hammering. I'm sure there's a reason for this. When the Sun is on the South Node, it means you were born on an eclipse. So in classical terms, the Sun has been gobbled up by the nodes. So when I see the Sun on the South Node, there is a story around somebody being themselves or really being able to express something about their identity. So if Chiron is there, that might add a little bit of a deeper soul story, because the South Node does talk about the past lives and the soul's journey through many lifetimes. That you're learning to be yourself. There's might be a deep pain or suffering around being yourself. And so I think it really depends on if it's Chiron in the ninth house, if the South Node is in the ninth house, then there's something around belief. This is just kind of like a story just to kind of create a potential scenario for this. That maybe it's another lifetime where somebody believed in something that was either heretical or it was not understood, or maybe even the person believed something to the point where it created a suffering, like limited beliefs. And so with that North Node in the third house, I do have a webinar on the lunar nodes, which I think is a good webinar. You're learning to see things from a new perspective and to have options. Hang on, I'm trying to read all this, folks. Lisa's saying it's lasting a long time with the retrograde. Being a renegade, status quo. Yeah, so if you're going through your Chiron return, what you're going through right now, it has deep subtext. It has deep levels to it. And this is a story that is both woven itself through this life, but also woven itself through other lifetimes. South Node in the sixth in Aquarius. I see Aquarius in the sixth house, because that's Aquarius is Virgo's sixth house. I always think of somebody who is the healer, but in that very scientific and technical way. So, with Aquarius, there's something around community and groups and feeling like, I didn't include this in the slide, but Aquarius is also intellect. It's a very smart sign. So there might be something where you think you know a lot. Like Aquarius also has a little bit of Sagittarius energy in it. Aquarius's 11th house is Sagittarius. So sometimes when I see the negative side of Aquarius, and I'm saying negative side because we're talking about the South Node, like the stuff that we sometimes gets in our way. We think we know everything. There's an intellect. It's like it's not true unless I can touch it, feel it, sixth house. But that North Node is in the 12th, and the 12th is about the ultimate leap of faith. It's spirituality. It's going beyond what you can touch and know objectively, and to go into something that is subjective. Sun transiting the 10th house in Aries. Oh, that's a lot of it's a lot of information. Sorry, I'm just trying to process this, Nicholas. Wait, sorry, Chiron, not the Sun. Oh, Chiron transiting the 10th house in Aries. If you have Aries on the 10th house, Nicholas, that Chiron transit's going to be really subtle. Um, and you might have to take a step back and see how you're doing the 10th house. Is there a story around being able to kind of occupy a certain space in the world, to be yourself in the world, to have a certain professional identity? I just noticed that when people have Aries on the 10th house, they tend to be very self-directed and very self-motivated. They're really great in a crisis, and sometimes they are even self-employed. So maybe there's a story right now, Nicholas, about having courage in your professional life. I would like to, I would personally like to see that in context with the rest of the chart. Good segue. If you guys want to parse this out a little bit more in a consultation, of course, that is something that I do. Tarrant says, Chiron conjunct the ascendant, conjunct the south node. So, I already sort of said this with, Chiron, the south node. There's this, old story that really goes into other lifetimes. When it's, Chiron's in the first house, do we have the courage to be ourselves, to take action in our life? It really depends on the sign. I'm just, you guys like coming up really quick with the comments. Give me a second. Chiron, South Node, Leo. Well, if Chiron and Cancer, so Chiron and Cancer is, you have what's called an out of sign conjunction. There's definitely an emotional component, and maybe even like a deep existential sadness to you being able to be yourself. But that's my quick read. Taryn, yes, if you have to go, I'm sorry. We will kind of getting towards the end of this, certainly. Gemma asks, how about Chiron, Aries in the 8th house? Yes, Chiron and Aries, you have to find your bravery, you have to find your courage. Chiron in the 8th house, you have to have the bravery and courage to go to the deepest parts of yourself in order to transform. So you might be feeling some very deep, material deep stuff, Gemma, as you go through your Chiron return. I don't know, I don't know the rest of your chart. I don't have it handy, but maybe that Chiron experience is really informing the next chapter of your life and what you're going to be able to offer to the world and offer to the collective. Okay, Nicholas, thank you for, good to know that that's spot on. Susan's asking about the Chiron trining. When you have a planet trine, that planet is a support for another planet. If Chiron, it's weird to think of Chiron, this thing of like, let's say wounds or of not being something that could support. And I think that when we have the trine, it's easier for us to maybe get to the higher potential of Chiron. I'm just, riffing at the moment. I would like to see that in context with the rest of the chart. I don't have a Chiron trine, do I? I just have the oppositions in the square. I think when you have the opposition in the square, it's just the energy is a lot more like confrontational. Like you have to really work and build with it. With a trine, trines can be very quiet. Sextiles are very quiet, but trines give us opportunities through the energy of Jupiter. Sextiles are the energy of Venus. Yeah, I know it's a lot of material to look through. Yes, this is why I like to talk about Chiron as the not the wound. People, I know you guys got to run. We'll be wrapping up in just a moment. With Chiron, does it mean that you work with your Chiron solar? I've got Chiron and Taurus. I don't know. Maybe there's other things. I know Taurus is a slow sign in general. It just likes to take its time. I just think Chiron and Taurus just really needs to feel safe. It needs to feel Taurus has an affinity with Cancer and the moon because the moon's exalted in Taurus. And I think that we just need to remember that Taurus, like Cancer, needs a lot of holding and cajoling, and it needs to feel safe. So for us to really work on the higher octave, the higher level of our Chiron and Taurus, we need to feel really safe. We need to feel really supported. Otherwise, we just feel really, unhappy with Chiron and Taurus. Oh yes, thank you, Gemma. I know a lot of you guys are repeats on my webinars, and I really enjoy it. Oh, that's a really great point about Chiron, Martin Lass. I'm not super familiar with his work, but I've heard of him. He wrote Healing Body, Mind, and Spirit. So there are, of course, there are other people that are working with Chiron. I just think the distinction that I wanted to make with people that it's it's a wound that we can heal. Before I wrap up, I just wanted to do a shameless plug for my webinar on Monday. I'm taking a risk putting them so close together, but I know you guys like to participate in these webinars, and the one that I'm doing on Monday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern is on a sneak peek of November's astrology. So November's astrology is it's Scorpio season, but it's also very much informed by Uranus and Taurus. So we've got some changes we got to make going into Scorpio season, but that's certainly what Scorpio season is all about. So do go to my website, empoweringastrology.com, if you want to learn more and to register, empowering.com/webinars. Let me stop the share. So give me a moment. I will stop the share. So yeah, there's a lot of tangents to go down. But Chiron is a thing in astrology that really speaks to me, and it's something that I've been paying attention to for a while. I mean, certainly within my professional career as an astrologer, and I've just found, whether it's through my own personal work or through the work, being a guide to my clients, that it really can show us where this story, this kind of fundamental story that we keep returning to. Yes, there's the nodes. Yes, there's the work that we're doing with our Saturn, and let's say the growth that we're doing with Uranus and Neptune and Pluto. But I think Chiron really shows what we're distilling things down to. As I was sharing with Chiron and Taurus, that knot is around value, and it's a story that you'll keep returning to. And certainly when people question my value, it hits a very deep point. And I'm sure, depending on where your Chiron is, when that story gets activated, it hits a very deep point. But it's this knot that we are working to heal and transcend, connecting to the collective experience of Chiron, so that we can go beyond this kind of personal story around pain and suffering that we keep repeating. We don't have to keep repeating it. Now, I have Chiron and Taurus. I'll always have Chiron and Taurus. You'll always have Chiron in Gemini, for example. But it's something that over time, through consciousness, through work, through healing, through working on this knot, that it is something that you begin to transcend, you have a deeper awareness of, and that you can help others. And if Chiron is something that's very prominent in your chart and in your astrology, that your work here in this lifetime is to take what has really made you suffer, made you feel pain, and use it to help others, so that it's no longer something that belongs to you, but it kind of belongs to this collective experience, and that we can all grow and heal from it. And I think that we feel Chiron when we see the people that have really gone beyond a story of pain, suffering, and limitation, and now they are living in that higher potential of who we are. So this really touches on my work as an astrologer and what I believe, what astrology can do as a tool for consciousness. So Chiron, small point, I think it's a very powerful point. I think we're still integrating what it means on a collective, on a human level, because it's only been something around that we've known about for the last 40 years. So thank you all for spending your Saturday with me, or if you're watching on the replay, thank you again. If you have questions, please email me. I really appreciate each and every one of you that invests your time with me and helps me to share my astrology with you all. Again and again, you guys sign up for my webinars. That's why I keep doing this, getting a chance to connect with you guys, and really help give you a different perspective on astrology. And that's really the heart and the root of empowering astrology. So I really, again, I appreciate you all. I thank you all. I hope you can join me for future webinars, including the one on Monday, which is on November's astrology. So go to empoweringastrology.com webinars, /webinars, and you'll see all the latest offerings, even past ones that you can purchase. Again, I have one on the lunar nodes. I have one on Saturn, for example. Do follow me on Instagram, Empowering Astro. I'm on Twitter. Of course, I'm on Facebook. And sign up for my newsletter. All this stuff is on my website. So again, thank you so much. I appreciate you guys. And until the next time, bye.